I am a professor. I'm a professor at the University of Athens, initially sociologist, but mainly gender studies person. Here in Athens, we're doing research and publications and work on gender and sexuality studies. Yulie's work is going to be an example of what we're doing. Yulie Papadakou is currently finishing her PhD on queer youth culture and subjectivity and sociabilities. She'll have the opportunity to talk us about that. So thanks for being here. Thanks to all of you. So Yulie, you have the floor, and we have around an hour, right, for this whole talk, I guess.
Yes, exactly, Mary.
Okay.
First, the presentation by Julie, and then you can open the question and answer session.
All right. So after Yulie's presentation, we'll start. We have the opportunity to exchange with the remarks, questions, or whatever. Thank you. Yulie, you have the floor.
Thank you. So firstly, I want to thank Civis Gender Studies Network and my supervisor, Mary Leontini, for giving me the opportunity to present my work here today, and of course, all of you who are here right now. So I'm sharing my screen. Can you see my presentation? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So this presentation is part of my PhD thesis, in which I studied the individual and collective paths of LGBTQ young people who were born in Greece during the 90s and resided in Athens during the period 2018 to 2020. It is based on 2 years of multi-sided ethnographic research, which focused on physical and digital social spaces, as well as on semi-structured in-depth interviews with young adults aged 18.5 to 32 years. The majority of my interlocutors grew up in Athens. Since the year 2000 and onwards, but especially after 2010, LGBTQ movements in Greece have been marking a growing visibility of the LGBTQ presence in the country. My interlocutors belong to the first Greek generation, which through youth collectivities articulates strong political claims around the early experiences of LGBTQ youth. In light of these rapidly emerging stories, discourses, and claims regarding LGBTQ children and youth, I explored the ways we can talk about youth's non-normative genders and sexualities in a manner that will go beyond predominant narratives of victimization. So what is it like? What does it entail to grow up queer in contemporary Greece? In what ways do the categories of age, gender, and sexuality intertwine, affect one another, and play out along this process? These are some of the guiding questions of my work. So my informants produced narratives of difference since their childhoods, even though most of them did not identify as LGBTQ until late adolescence or even later. In their words, the boys were quiet, sensitive, non-athletic, or studious, and often report being estranged from boys in homosocial groups. The girls, sometimes estranged from popular girls' homosocial groups and disciplined by hegemonic masculinities, were the untidy, sloppy, athletic, assertive girls, the girls who did not look like girls, or the ones who during their adolescence still behaved in a childish manner, which made them look ridiculous. Their recollections suggest a certain asynchronicity with their peers. They did not like the things they were supposed to like, such as certain games or clothes, and they did not spontaneously do things when it was expected of them. They describe themselves as affect aliens in Sarah Ahmed's terms, meaning that they experienced a gap between the promise of happiness and the way they were affected by objects that promise happiness. Their narrative suggests feeling at odds with the world or feeling that the world is odd. They were the strangers in their schools and often in their families. They were present in their group, but they did not fully belong. In what follows, I will focus on patterns of resistance which emerged in my interlocutors' autobiographical narratives of growing up. As far as the concept of growing up is concerned, I draw from Catherine Bond Stockton's notion of growing sideways. In line with Stockton's approach, but also other recent post-structuralist approaches of childhood, I suggest that the child is what we are not. It is the act of adults looking back. Since gay childhood is culturally produced as a scene of impossibility, I consider the queer children as ghostly figures which haunt my interlocutors' past selves and memories. According to Stockton, if a central control mechanism of childhood is delay, through the control of the rhythms of cultural transmission, then children on their journeys to adulthood learn to use this delay in order to grow sideways. Sideways signifies an horizontal, lateral, or even backwards movement instead of a vertical upward movement towards full stature, marriage, work, reproduction, and the loss of childishness. It is a form of resistance that works through and with the temporal framework of delay instead of directly against it. I interpret my interlocutors' practices as tactics, in line with Desserteau's conceptualization of everyday practices as versatile actions of consumption, or else uses of cultural products. In Desserteau's framework, this consumption is not a passive process, but rather entails the production of new, we might say deviant, meanings, which have specific private value for the consumers. A tactic is an art of the weak and is different from a strategy in that it lacks power over a locus. It lacks its own place and autonomy. While a strategy presupposes a subject of will and power, a tactic is a maneuver within the enemy's field of vision and territory. Tactic is all about finding the right moment to act, dependent on cracks and chance and on taking advantage of opportunities. Tactic shows itself not in its own products, where would it place them, he wonders, but in an art of using those imposed on it. In other words, Desserteau is interested not as much on what is used, but on how it is used. So what do children do when they cannot or do not want to grow up according to heteronormative standards? What possibilities do they have to shape and express their subjectivities, to counter their targetings, to form intimate relationships in a heteronormative world? What other ways of growing up do they devise to emerge out of such a scene of impossibility? I have identified 9 types of tactics in my interlocutors' narratives, which correspond to 3 often overlapping modalities. That is, queer relationalities, queer temporalities, and queer practices. The first set of tactics is escaping in imaginary worlds. My interlocutors stressed the importance of fiction and imagination in their childhoods, which signals the creation of another space and time, inside or beyond social space and historical time. Imaginary worlds become possible through the consumption of cultural products and give queer children the opportunity to become directors, script writers, actors and actresses exercising some kind of control over their own story. In imaginary worlds, the borders of gender, age, and sexuality are troubled. For example, Alkisti, a 30-year-old trans woman, describes herself as a different child, which was not exactly present, but rather lost in its own world. She remembers fantasizing about Sailor Moon saving the world, even though her father used to mock her and say it's for girlies. She says, well, let me give you an example. I had a game as a child that I called fantasy. And what was that game? Me running around something or somewhere and just imagining things. Stories that I liked, things that I had seen on TV happening one way or another. That is, I really liked to free my mind of limitations, let it fly here and there, get lost in the worlds. As a matter of fact, from one point onwards, I even remember not doing that out in the open. I mean, many times I would enter a room, close the door, sometimes lock the shutters, and run around, and if someone could see inside the room, it was a child running up and down the walls, and they would wonder, what is wrong with this weirdo? The image of space, sealed by the other's gaze, comes in direct contrast to the unstoppable movement of Alkisti, whose body and mind bend the limits by running around, flying here and there until exhaustion. Alkisti now thinks that she invented fantasy in search of a way out because something wasn't right with her, but she lacked the means to touch it yet. In the forbidden figure of Sailor Moon, who stars in fantasy saving the world, we see the willfulness of the child expressed through the disobedience to the father's wishes. Power, which turns a parental, social, and national wish into a command, is challenged by Alkisti, who flees Sailor Moon in her own space and time. Imagination then signifies her ability to maintain her highly contested self-image and teaches her that dominant narratives can be manipulated for private ends. The child here is not defined by innocence, but by insistence, and from the perspective of adults, impertinence. Respectively, Nikos, a 27-year-old trans man, remembers that he would find a shelter, that's how he called it, to the world of Digimon. Wishing to grow up and leave, he used to make believe that Digimon actually exist and that he will meet them in his future. We might say that Digimon here become the vehicle for the designation of a non-reproductive queer future. As you might already know, Digimon are digital monsters, and unlike children, they don't evolve to heterosexual reproductive adults. Imaginary worlds then open up a space of potentiality where social norms can be transformed and gender and age boundaries transgressed. They create a second parallel scenario with a liberating function. The second set of tactics is conforming to gender and sexual norms, but in order to bypass disciplinary mechanisms. In this case, my informants try to execute the heterosexual script by flirting or dating people of the opposite gender in a calculated maneuver of avoiding discipline. For example, Kyriakos remembers how he shortly dated a girl in order to investigate his desire. In his own words, she liked me, I didn't like her, but when I had started to realize, that's bad, when I had started to realize that I like my classmates, he means another boy, the one I mentioned that I had a very strong crush on, that girl asked if I would date her. And I thought, okay, let's try it. Maybe this is my chance to forget it. So we dated for a month and a half. I realized that I don't like the girl even a little, and I asked her to break up. So it was pretty bad for the girl, but what can we do? These things happen. So here Kyriakos uses the heteronormative imperatives of adolescent socialities to confirm or reject his homoerotic desire. In retrospect, these tactics serve to buy time, to maintain or improve their status in the hierarchies of peer groups, and later on they are used to confirm homoerotic desire through the rejection, of course. The third set of tactics is refusing to grow up. I also tend to think of these subjects as the Peter Pan boys because they're boys. For example, Tassos explains how he did not embrace his sexuality from a young age and was hesitant to leave his childishness behind, unlike other boys in 7th grade who spoke in mannish ways and talked about girls and sex. He said, I kind of started going into the world really deep and wondered, what do I really want? What friend groups do I want to find? Do the groups that I want even exist? I wanted to find like the carefree people we used to hang out with at the elementary school. I thought to myself, will I find them now in high school? How come have you suddenly transformed to a man from the 6th to the 7th grade in just 1 year? What happened now? Yeah, it kind of changes. I don't know why. He dissociates himself from practices that produce heterosexual masculinities such as sex talk, masturbating and showing off masturbation, homophobic acts, and circulation of heterosexual pornographic material among boys. Tassos questioned his suspicion. He's suspicious of the sudden growing up of other boys and men, and is determined to stay a carefree and asexual boy instead. Other signs of prolonging childhood and delaying sexual meaning is trying to convince themselves that their feelings for other boys are just a phase, a yet immature expression of an hormonally induced form of sexuality. So some boys prolong their childhoods in order to avoid positioning themselves as homoerotic young men. By doing so, they create a vagueness around their sexuality. They defer meaning, they don't give an answer, and in fact partly defend it as they leave open the possibility of homoerotic desire for the future. This tactic did not come up with informants who were girls, as they did not as much portray themselves as innocent. It seems that boys have more access to the idealized figure of the innocent child, in what Hannah Dyer refers to as asymmetries of innocence. The fourth set of tactics is targeted alignments with dominant cultural meanings of the male and female body. During their teenage years, the pressure to conform to what Eckert calls heterosexual marketplace as a developmental imperative, on which their position in the hierarchy of adolescent sociality depends, increases. In this case, my informants readjust themselves in terms of their voice, their stature, the way they move and walk, and clothing. Some boys who face teasing from their peers and/or have doubts about their heterosexuality enter a phase of self-observation and readjustment of bodily utterances to hide their differentiation. Boys' clothing should show no signs of special care. They wear clothes relatively loose and bright colors are avoided. Boys who wear fashionable or tight clothes and care too much about their cleanliness run the risk of being labeled gays or adelphés or sissies, which is adelphés in Greece. Heterosexual masculinity in boys' student culture is carefully constructed through a seeming indifference to style and appearance. Yannis, a 23-year-old gay young man, explains that he would wear only sweatpants and loose sweaters like all other boys, despite his interest in fashion, because, as he said, boys are not supposed to care about fashion. If in the case of boys, visible preoccupation with the body and clothing might call into question their masculinities, for teenage girls, such practices must be displayed. Some of them strive to have slim and shapely bodies, dress in sexy, youthful clothes that highlight body shape, and wear makeup. Conforming with womanly embodied practices has benefits at the time. These benefits may relate to prevention of homophobic harassment, avoidance of stigmatization, and better inclusion in girls' groups. For example, Artemi, a 27-year-old lesbian woman, describes how she transformed from an athletic and untidy girl to an aspiring woman in 7th grade, which then enhanced her inclusion in girls' homosocial groups. Artemi's better inclusion in girls' groups meant that she could form sideways relations with the girls she was interested in her own words. When I went to middle school, I decided to make a radical change in my style and join my friends from elementary school who were the bimbos, the famous of the school, and also become like that. So I straightened my hair to go to school every day. I painted my nails. I dressed up. We all agreed on what to wear the day before. We were just talking about boys and I don't know, it was a bleak situation. Just me enjoying hanging out with the girls for a change. It was a nice combo too. I mean, I changed my outfit, so I started noticing that there was more social acceptance, and I saw that boys also started looking at me. These practices here serve to both better her status in the peer hierarchy and to approach the objects of her desire. She uses heteronormative and developmental discourses to fulfill her own purposes. The next set of tactics is symbolizing liminality through stylistic bricolage. Eccentric style emerges as a process of stylistic bricolage, which makes use of the supermarket of style of postmodernity. It draws meanings from different historical periods, subcultures, age groups, and blurs the boundaries between masculinity and femininity. It seems that eccentric style as a tactic in adolescence is deployed more by my informants who are now cis women and trans men, women, or non-binary. This is related to the different ways in which fashion and preoccupation with the body are marked in the cultures of young boys and girls, respectively. Overt and intense preoccupation with the body and appearance are conceptualized as feminine practices. Hence, they are capitalized by those subjects who have already been excluded or fallen from the status of boy/men, and not by those struggling to be included to it. In general, these informants struggle with their clothes. Clothing can be both hurtful and liberating for these subjects. As Stockton suggests, queer people's preference for certain clothes and their rejection of others might be indicative of a humiliation or a wound which is placed on public view and in a self-sacrificing gesture is addressed to hands willing to catch it. As we see in Nadine's words, items such as vests, Dr. Martens boots, hats, ties, shirts, sometimes plaid shirts, suits, as well as stylistic elements from other eras, such as Victorian dresses and monocles, become cultural symbols for creating and expressing social meanings. Eccentric style signifies a way to present an aesthetically coherent self and at the same time to symbolize their liminality. In other words, alternative gender stylistic performances become both the marker of their exclusion and the way they survive. As Butler suggests, style as a form of agency which expresses the subject's demand for cultural and psychic and political survival is expressed here. The sixth set of tactics is the use of the cultural ideal of the politicized teenager. Some informants report that they would hide behind the image of a politicized teenager to distance themselves from homophobic discourses and to clandestinely, undercover, transform their schools in more LGBTQ-friendly environments. For example, Dimitris remembers, I had pressured my class to do something for the HIV/AIDS Day, all by myself. I said, you guys, it's not possible to still believe that it is transmitted by handshake, by drinking from the same glass of water and so on. And I put them all down. I put the whole class to make the red ribbons, like I bought the bookmarks we had and the pins. And I said, we will make them so that all the people who will enter the auditorium today, where the whole high school entered, we are talking about 200 people, that everyone will have ribbons and the teachers and all that for the whole day. I look back at myself now, and it seems so funny and weird and surreal how I did such a thing. Dimitris emphasizes both how he marked the bodies of all the members of the school community with the ribbons, and how brave, clever, and subversive such an act was for a closeted student. The next set of tactics is the use of the cultural ideal of the good child and the end of secondary education as an horizon to queer futures. For example, Katya describes how she embodied the ideal of the good child, who enjoys recognition from adults and avoids conflict until later in life, when it will find itself in a more powerful social position. In her own words, I was a model child. That is, a child who never makes mistakes, a child who is excellent, a childhood. Essentially now, after a distance and after years, I have fulfilled all my mom's dreams. So I ended up with honors. Generally, I was a kid who never caused trouble. I was a very quiet kid, good at school, because as a child, I didn't have any relationships. I mean, it wasn't that I was going out with boys, cruising around, smoking, doing the things that one might say that teenagers do nowadays. I am not accepted for my looks. I am not accepted for my sexuality, which only I knew. I was trying to be accepted because I have achieved something. So I went about it like this. And for this reason, I tried hard to study and be an excellent student and to be a child who doesn't cause problems. For many of my interlocutors, boys and girls alike, studying as a tactic camouflages their difference and ascribes meaning to their loneliness and the absence of heterosexual relationships. School achievement becomes the vehicle to the presumed independence of adulthood, which promises greater freedom and self-control. As a matter of fact, Christina, a 21-year-old pansexual, confessed that she used school success as an horizon for a queer future. She viewed educational achievement as her opportunity to go to the university, change her everyday environments, distance herself from her family of origin, and lead an LGBTQ life. The next set of tactics is alliances between strangers in students' cultures. These alliances create a social space inside which the subject is not produced as deviant. Other outsiders are students with immigrational background or other considered as gender deviants. Sometimes it's interesting because queer alliances are reported which form on the basis of a silent pact. Tassos, who refused to grow up, remembers. I grew up with we were four people who changed my life because we could be together morning to night at school and in the neighborhood, and we did things that we just found they were interests that connected us very loosely. That is, it was like that, without even having to communicate with each other. We happily did what we had arranged to do. We would go for walks from morning till night. We would climb the mountains. We didn't go for coffees or, in general, we led a different kind of life, which was very interesting. And it developed into a phase where all four of us came out later, that all four of us are gay. It was so interesting because you think, how come I'm pulling these people? You know, it's impossible. As soon as I met them, I felt something anyway. This group of boys did not form after the recognition and revelation of LGBTQ identities, as they were not formed yet. It was based on a silent contract between boys who refused to grow up and participate in practices which produce heterosexual masculinities. The boys' successive coming outs to themselves and one another occurred after the graduation from secondary education. And the last set of practices of tactics is, of course, secrets and lies, and the importance of the internet, the quest of the LGBTQ community. This quest takes place before graduation from secondary education, outside of school, and secretly from the family. The internet makes it possible while they are still students or sometimes after graduation. However, some of them entered local LGBTQ socialities during the schooling years. In these cases, they usually meet other LGBTQ people online in chat rooms, and this is true for my informants who grew up in Athens. Sometimes they meet them in person afterwards. These encounters usually make things go faster. The first acquaintances are usually more or less older, adult LGBTQ people who are portrayed as protective figures that enhance the entrance of my informants in the local queer communities. They contribute to a speedy process of queer world making that is an ongoing practice of seeking, finding, and again touching an aspect of being with and in the world, as Munoz defines brown worlding. Meeting the LGBTQ culture signifies a sense of acceleration as opposed to delay, and it opens up pathways for their futures. Nevertheless, sometimes this quest is limited to the online world and involves the consumption of mainly Anglophone cultural products such as movies and series, as Alik describes. She says, I had analyzed all the queer YouTube there was. Well, yes, then it was the peak of YouTubers like Hello Steph. I was looking for couples, same-sex couples who made videos together about their lives, the tests they went through, all that. I watched them consistently. It was my training. I watched series, I watched movies. Wherever I saw that there was a same-sex couple, especially with girls, I was like, yes, I'll see it. I had been watching the L World with my headphones on all summer on the couch. I had also cut scenes of Carmen and Shane. I had learned how to use the editing. I had cut their scenes from every episode and combined them on my own DVD, that much. I watched Grey's Anatomy from the beginning of high school, and in it were also Arizona and Cali, also a same-sex couple. These were my references. This was my LGBT education from YouTube. I think it had helped me quite a bit. I felt better. I felt that I was not alone. I felt that I know more or less, or that everything is not completely unknown. Positioning themselves in parts of the LGBTQ culture consolidates LGBTQ identity. Inscription of collective meanings on their past experiences is sensed as eventually finding their place in the world. And some concluding remarks. Kvortrap suggests that childhood is about waiting. Children are waiting to obtain capabilities and knowledge, legal rights, to mature, to have a say in social matters, to grow up and become adults. The temporalities of children are determined by delay, which differs meanings and possibilities for adulthood. My informant's accounts of growing up show how, within the temporal framework of delay, children are not passively waiting, following vertical, linear, and progressive time. They rather work with it. They might even stretch it out more, wait even more. They devise sideways maneuvers and eventually undermine dominant cultural discourses of growing up in order to produce their own meanings for themselves and the world. For example, they position themselves in and against the narrative of the idealized and sentimentalized innocent child, which only proves that they were not that innocent after all, whatever that means. Children here are not produced as innocent, obedient, and mere victims, but they come up as complex subjects, willful and even unruly, or as Halberstam put it, anarchic beings who partake in strange and inconsistent temporal logics. The temporal framework of delay and the cultural unintelligibility of gay childhood become the playgrounds of queer children. Lurking behind locked doors and seemingly clear-cut practices, they plot and they scheme other futures and desires, and they highlight non-reproductive affective modalities and relationalities. My informants as children make do in their everyday lives by employing diffused, non-sequential tactics, which only serve to obey their own alternative rhythms. Stockton claims that the gay child, which appears as a ghost in the memories of adults, illuminates the darkness of the child. It outlines, she says, in shadowy form, the pain, closets, emotional labors, sexual motives, and sideways movements that attend all children, however we deny it. Thank you.
Okay, Yulie, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this exciting presentation. We're opening the floor to questions, remarks. No? Yes?
There is a question in the chat, Mary, if you can read.
No, I can't read it. Is there a question?
Oh.
No.
Oh, no, actually, they're just saying thank you for the presentation and for the inspiring ideas.
It is inspiring, but inspiring what? Yes, Renate.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, so much for your presentation. I found it very touching also. I was like, oh my God, I love that. I think it shows like all these strategies and how this can also, yeah, like, and it's always interesting to see like, because you talk to the people and they talked about their past, right? So it's always like, it's always interesting to see how people then conceptualize their past. Would you say, so this is a qualitative research with same structures interviews. Is it, how often did you see each of these strategies? Because I can imagine that you saw like, it's very different ones, and in how many people did you see maybe similar strategies? Maybe you could expand a bit on that.
Well, I haven't, thank you. Thank you for your comment and question. I haven't actually counted how many reported this kind of tactics, but I can say that they were diffused and scattered, and but I would say that more than one people exhibited each tactic. At least 3 people, or when I identified the tactic, I could see traces of it in another interview. But at the time of the interview, I wasn't as much alert about everything. So I know I've lost things. But yes, I could see traces in other interviews as well. Yeah.
Yes, if I may add, I'd rather say it's rather a tendency that is diffuse, as Yulie said, in all her material. And often, because it happened to us to talk about and analyze her participant observation as well, often traces, as she says, of these attitudes were found in everyday encounters, small events that were happening during the fieldwork.
Exactly. Yeah.
Emmy?
Yes. Thank you, Yulie. This was really great, I think. I think the framework of queer temporality really works great for this material. I think it's really, really productive here. I was wondering whether you could see in your material also a spatiality. How, I mean, in not seldom in queer stories, there's also a spatiality that kind of perhaps a coming out story may be connected to a physical moving to the larger city, maybe to Athens in the case of Greece, or staying in the countryside. That moving or not moving, the space where one is, that also has kind of identity implication. Was that something that came across in your material?
Thank you very much for your question. Well, I know that time is bound with space, so we cannot talk about time without considering space. For example, in Alkistis' description of how she would close a room and start running around and fantasizing. She was trying to create a space even in Desserteau's terms. Desserteau distinguishes between place, where you have power over a place, you have a locus, and space, which is more ephemeral. So she's trying to create a space, a world is consisted by both space and time. So this is what I can say now. But also this group of boys which was based on a silent pact. The places they would move and they would socialize were different than their heterosexual peers. As I said, we wouldn't go for coffees, we would go for walks, we would go to the cinema, we would go to the mall and shop, for example. So maybe, yes, I could see some aspects of space. Yeah.
Maybe also just to give the framework, these kids, these young people with whom Yulie talked, grew up as queer, lesbians, gay, whatever, however they presented themselves, in Athens. So resistances and all these, it's not, we should not generalize this issue about resistance and the possibility of growing up queer for the whole country. That's something that is okay. It's the space, the way Yulie is seeing the space is much more complicated, much more sophisticated than my own comment. But just because we are on an international group, we should not think that growing up queer, even during the millennium years, was easy or possible, not even possible in some provincial areas of the country. There is a question here, I'm not sure I understand, maybe you could help me. I was wondering if the tactics of in childhood delay can be, if the tactics of delay in childhood, I guess, no? Can be also used in the adult world, but I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, it reminds me of the conceptualization of queer time and place of Halberstam. I mean, LGBTQ adults who don't marry, don't have children, and they don't use a homonormative kind of life. What Halberstam says is that they might, during their weekends, they might attend queer subcultural events, for example, and at the time during the weekend when they're same-aged people are with their families and going to social events and things like that, they are in, like dark spaces with not so much lighting and subcultural events and things like that. This is a queer time. That's what Halberstam says. This is what I can think of this comment. So it's a kind of refusing to grow up and become a serious adult who has a very serious job and very organized life, and that's what I can think about this.
I see Sophia Fitselu, maybe it's a Greek name, that wants to interview.
Yes, I can write in the chat if you want, or I can speak. Okay, thank you, Yulie, for the presentation. It was very interesting. And I think a very interesting aspect of it was the common loneliness and the feeling of otherness that a lot of these people seem to feel and relate throughout their stories. One thing that I was very surprised that it wasn't mentioned, maybe, because of the time, or maybe there weren't people in this case, but it surprised me how there was no mention of the religious aspect of Greece. Greece happens to be a very traditional country, and a lot of times we see even people who are not traditionally religious, even those who are casual, can have certain beliefs that are connected to it, and they can create prejudice. And it has been seen how sometimes even the feeling of otherness is not only for the homophobia and transphobia that is already kind of connected to a political aspect of things, but also a sort of religious one. And so my question is how, for example, family can affect queer children growing up. We have seen two mentions in your presentation. One that was, for instance, the girl who worked to be a good student, who made her mother's dream come true, who used her identity as a student in a way to be accepted. And another with a boy who was criticized by his father for watching, for example, Sailor Moon, because the father connected it to being for girls. So I was thinking, even in some cases we see in newer generation, where sometimes there have been instances for a parent to be a bit more open-minded about these sort of things. We have seen other relatives from older generation who are still very closed off, either for political reasons or religious reasons, who kind of portray an obstacle for this. So I was wondering, how would you think it would be possible for a parent who might be someone from a newer generation, who might be a bit stuck in this, to be able to become more accepting towards a child who discovers their sexuality?
Thank you for your question. Let me rephrase to see if I understand your final...
Julie, excuse me. No, just to be, since the time is running, there is also a question by Francesca Stella in the chat. If you want, I can read it for you, but it's better to collect both of them and then give an answer to both. Can you read it?
Yes, I can see it.
Thank you. Sorry to disturb you.
No, thank you very much. So, is the question how an LGBTQ child may act, should act in order to? Is this the question? In order to better deal with their parents' situation? No?
I think the last question is from Francesca Stella, who talks about gender dimensions.
Oh, your question.
So. No, I meant your question.
Oh, mine. Sorry, I thought you meant the one from the chat. Yes.
Yes?
Yes, it was the upbringing.
The upbringing, yes, but the question was, what should an LGBTQ child do? I have no idea.
Like to create an allyship, for example, from a parent to a child. We see there's certain awareness that is becoming slowly towards them, I think. So I was wondering, how do you think, perhaps from the stories that you have heard, how a parent could be able to overcome their prejudice and to help their children, even if it's something they do not understand?
Well, okay. The way I see it is that every subject has all the data that it needs to make their own decisions. What I can say is what I analyzed and I extracted from my interlocutors' narratives, and the situation with their parents is a very charged topic, and as long as they're minors, what I can say is that they face greater suspicion, and their parents don't believe them because they are minors. The parents think that their children are young and they don't know, then they are confused. They should wait and have more experiences, and they use age so as to reject their desires and their subjectivities. That's what I can say. We can't hear you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Could you please take the question on the chat by Francesca Stella?
Yes. It is the gentleman. Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, I have studied my participants' broader lives and identities until the moment we met. They were pretty young. Some of them weren't far from high school. As far as there was a question about their futures. It is very hard for them to imagine a future. This may have to do with the political and social instability in Greece, but also maybe internationally. They were not able to tell me about how they can imagine their lives in 10 years, for example. They would say how they would wish to be in 10 years. So I'm not sure. Well, as far as they leave school, like secondary education, and they either meet queer or LGBTQ groups, things go really fast. They are content with themselves, and they are very happy, even if in their universities they're not recognized or kind of not discriminated against, but invisible. That's what I would say.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Are there? Okay. Thanks a lot, Yulie. Thanks to all of you for being here, for all these interesting questions that gave us the possibility to exchange. And if I'm correct, the next Civis meeting is going to take place, Gender Civis, on May 17, right? Is this right? I guess so. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to Marcella, thanks to everybody, to Emil, and everybody for organizing all this.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you. Thanks to Julie. Thanks to all the participants. And see you next time.
Okay, thank you.